So, welcome to the Schuman Talk for January the 1st of 2025. And we're discussing issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for Europe as a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. And I'm talking to you here from Amsterdam, from the upper room, our salon, right in the heart of the city, right opposite the Central Railway Station. It was on May the 9th in 1950, at 6 p.m., that the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house, where today 450 million Europeans live together in peace. Now, I like to call this the defining moment of post-war Europe because it launched the European movement for peace and unity that has led to today's European Union. And that was a movement that was rooted in forgiveness and reconciliation based on Christian values. Schuman himself was a very devout believer. And so our guest today is engaged in promoting these same values in the area of the polarization that's happened in our society. And she has co-edited a book called The Church, the Far Right, and the Claim to Christianity. She is Dr. Helen Paynter. She is from the Bristol Baptist College, where she heads up the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence. And she's going to be talking about how we can respond to the far right's use of Christian-sounding language. So we want to welcome you, Helen, into the studio.
Thank you.
And say thank you very much for being with us today. Now, you are a theologian, and you have one of the leading roles of the Bristol Baptist College. Is that the right name?
Yes.
Baptist College, yes. And but that's not how you started your career. I understand you were a medical specialist.
I was a nephrologist, a kidney specialist originally. Well, not originally, yes. I suppose I got there in the end. Took a few years.
So you've gone from kidneys to souls.
Indeed. Yes.
How did you make that? Why did you make that change?
I called to ministry.
Just a call, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, there's a much longer version of that, but I won't bore you or the listeners with it. Yeah, called to Christian ministry, came here to study, and during the course of my study, became clear that I was called to theological education. I mean, I've served as minister in 2 local churches as well, but it became clear that was where my prime calling was. Had a couple of conversations with the then principal here, who would say to me, Helen, do you think you're called to be a theological educator? And I'd say, no, I'm called to ministry. And he said, yes, but there's different forms of ministry, Helen. So we went around that loop a few times. And then I did a PhD and continued from there.
So you're heading up now the Center for Bible and the Study of Bible and Violence. Now, That sounds very intriguing. Tell us a bit more about what you're doing and how do others get involved in that?
Yeah, thank you. So, yes, I founded this study center in kind of late 2018. We had our first events in 2019. And so we gather people who are working in the intersection of Bible and violence. I'll explain a bit about what that means in a minute. And we gather that fairly loosely. We've got a number of people who are part of the team we haven't got a huge team here. We just kind of gather people who are working often in other institutions or sometimes independent scholars. And we look to facilitate research and to bring that research into impact for the church. So I tend to see what we do as a kind of 2x2 grid. So one side is looking at interpretation of scriptural violence, and that's where I started off, and I still work in that area. And the other side is looking at the weaponization of scripture, the way that scripture becomes employed to endorse or justify violence, which is the sort of thing we're talking about this morning. So those are the 2 areas that we work in. And then the other sort of division of the grid is that we do academic work in those areas, but we really want what we do ultimately to impact the church. And so we look to do a lot of church-facing events, produce church-facing resources out of what we hope is good, rigorous work. So that's essentially what we do. How do people get involved? Have a look at our website, CSBV, short for Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence, csbvbristol.org.uk. We've got a YouTube channel with lots and lots of resources on there as well. We run an online MA in Bible and Violence. Well, actually, technically, it's Durham's MA in Theology, Ministry and Mission, but it's a Bible and Violence track. accredited by Durham University, and we have PhD students as well, working in a number of related areas. So yeah, we're quite lively. There's quite a lot going on.
So, given today's political landscape in Britain, and we're very conscious right now in America with Donald Trump having won the election and supported by many Christians, situation across Europe as well. Would you comment on the relevance of this centre for our current situation?
I can't. I mean, everyone thinks their own work's important, and of course, there are many, many things that are important in the world. But this, to me, feels like one of the most important issues facing the church right now. Actually, politically, other areas where the church colludes with violence. We think about the kind of ecclesial abuse scandals and the cover-ups, and there's a theology. This isn't simply systematic failure, although it is that, but there's kind of theologically based cover-ups, and it's so important. And thinking back actually to my medical background, there's a well-known aphorism: above all, do no harm. we could do worse than adopt that in the church, and sadly, it needs saying.
Yeah. Well, this book that you've co-written, "The Church, the Far Right, and the Claim to Christianity," is really talking about how the rise of the far right parties are using Christian-sounding language, but very often used to describe values actually contrary to the Christian faith. Your focus is Britain. There's an obvious parallel to Europe as a whole, and indeed globally, as we've just mentioned. Can we begin with what you observe in Britain and ask later, then, what can we learn for the European context?
Yes, thank you. And interestingly, this project emerged out of engaging with work that had been done in Europe. And I felt that we were behind the curve in the UK in terms of responding to these issues. Yeah, I mean, the far right or extreme right or whatever, the language is slippery and tricky. But we've got a wide variety of forms in the UK. We've got forms that are within or on the fringes of political mainstream. We've got things that are further out, and then things that are organisations that are illegal and underground. And those more extreme forms are constantly reinventing themselves, constantly renaming themselves. And a group will emerge. It'll be declared illegal, then they'll kind of go underground and pop up again with a different name. So there's a whole lot of stuff on the dark web, on the fringes. But then there's a whole lot of stuff that is more mainstream. Hope Not Hate is an organisation that does quite a lot of research into this area in the UK, and they plot these things. They produce a report every year called The State of Hate, and their report, published in 2024, said that it was obviously looking back a year. It said 2023 was the year when the mainstream far right kind of came of age, and so they plot some of these ideas and these tropes, and they notice, they identify that this shift in what's called the Overton window. So the Overton window is a way of expressing what we can. It's a model that represents what we can say publicly in a way
publicly acceptable.
What's publicly acceptable, exactly so. And then there are things that are kind of just a bit kind of off color, but kind of no one's going to kick up too much of a fuss, and then you can go further and further away from that. But Overton windows shift over time, and
in other words, what we were talking 10 years ago is now we're used to it. Yeah.
Exactly so. And we've seen a substantial shift of the Overton window to the right within the last 10 years. I mean, not least 2 consecutive Home Secretaries in this country who have said some things that absolutely it could not have been said out loud, would not have been said out loud.
Like what? Can you give an example?
And I can't quote a Home Secretary right this minute, but our previous Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, used language of used language of pickaninnies, spoke about watermelons, referring to black people, spoke about women in burqas looking at letterboxes. These are, these are things that the Prime Minister the then Prime Minister is saying. So this sort of language, yes.
Yes. Okay, that's helpful. Yeah. Yeah.
So Hope Not Hate plot this shift, and they would suggest that it's actually the more mainstream elements of these hard right movements, which are those are more dangerous in the UK right now than the more extreme elements. We are happily behind the curve compared to some parts of the world with regard to these movements, but we are definitely seeing a move in that direction. But whereas in certain parts of the world, there's a lot of violence enacted in this ideology, we're not yet seeing a huge amount of that. We're seeing some, but not a huge amount. So these illegal and very extreme groups do not have public plausibility at the moment. What does have public plausibility is the softer edge of that. And that, in a sense, is more dangerous, therefore. Kaz Mudder's done a lot of work around these groups, and the language he uses of extreme right and far right, I think I've got that terminology right, that the principle behind it is that both of these groups, as he categorizes them, are in opposition to liberal democracy. The extreme right wants to overthrow democracy. And most people in the UK would look at that and say that is a bad thing. However, what he would term the far right, they act in the name of democracy, but actually they are opposing liberal democracy, the separation of powers, the protection of minority voices, and so on. And that then is the area that is particularly dangerous in the UK right now because of this kind of veneer of respectability.
Yeah. Now, Jean-Marie Le Pen has just passed away. And of course, the way he's being talked about in the press is he's the one who brought populism into the mainstream, which is what you're talking about, this Overton window. What used to be seen as really extreme is now becoming mainstream. And that's been happening here in the Netherlands, in many other countries as well. So when we talk about them being committed to certain values, certain causes, and so on, some of which sound actually the kind of causes we might want to espouse too, as we could call ourselves Bible-believing Christians. It seems like we're caught in a dilemma because you've just been talking about liberal democracy, but there are aspects of liberalism that we would have great difficulty with, because liberalism really focuses on autonomous individuals, society, autonomous from God and autonomous from each other, but basically working together so long as it's mutually self-serving. And there are aspects of the liberal society that we would want to object to as well. So we find ourselves caught between liberalism on the one hand and this extremism of usually it's populist on the other. So tell us about what are these commitments that these extreme right or far right movements have, and that we can explore. Now, to what degree do we agree, and where do we draw the line?
Yeah, thank you. And it is really complex, and these movements are very heterogeneous. I mean, even we're going to come on to the kind of intersection with the Christian faith in a minute, but even just to introduce that idea that some of these movements will act explicitly in the name of Christianity. And some of these movements, especially some of the more extreme ones, are tied up with paganism, tied up with Satanism, a whole range of faith commitments or faith espousals. So that's an example of the really heterogeneous nature of these groups. So I'm going to I'll go through the ideologies that we tend to see, but people won't necessarily represent all of them. And I don't want to be heard as saying that all of these are, in the way that you've outlined, actually, I don't want to be heard as saying that all of these are reprehensible. Some of these have good foundations, I think, and are maybe being espoused in but more extreme or violent ways. So,
and reactions to liberalism, where
indeed,
liberalism is definitely in contradiction to Christianity.
Indeed. So, in no particular order, there is a narrative of kind of cleaning up the ethics, the moral conduct of our country, and that might be around getting drugs off the streets. It might be, it's often around issues of human sexuality and gender identity, yeah, I think we will recognise those narratives. We might even be able to hear echoes that we heard those narratives in, for example, Nazi Germany, which isn't necessarily to say that there isn't some value behind these instincts, I suppose. So that's one of them. A second one is around Muslims, around Islamophobia, around, well, multiculturalism, I suppose, is wider than that, but these things are all nesting together. And they are seen as a threat to the Christian nation. So some of these ideologies kind of, they often have a nostalgia for often a constructed and imagined past. Yes. Sometimes that nostalgia is expressed as the golden age of the Christian nation, which I'm not quite sure when they think that happened. Maybe the 1950s, maybe the Victorian era. I'm not quite clear. But obviously that was a day when Britain was much whiter than it is now. Yes. And so the increase in the number of Muslims in this country is seen as a threat to that. Multiculturalism in its broader sense is seen as a threat to that. The use of kind of fear of Muslim violence is often used as a kind of code. It's more acceptable to say we don't want to be blown up by Islamists than it is to say we don't want any more dark-skinned people on our streets. But actually, the one can often be a code for the other. So again, I think we can see how there's things in here that I think most Christians would want to say, yes, I have some concerns in some of these areas. I don't want to be blown up by Islamists. But does that necessarily mean that we need to, fear all Muslims and so on? So that's another area. A further area, which is even more complex, is the attitude towards Jews. So traditionally, hard right movements have been rampantly anti-Semitic, and we certainly see elements of extreme anti-Semitism in some of these groups, or less extreme, more kind of plausible language of anti-Semitism in some of these groups. However, because I suppose particularly because of this current situation in the Middle East, if one is going to align oneself against all Muslims, then one might naturally then lean towards a pro-Israel stance and therefore perhaps a Zionist stance. So, but of course, those who study Zionism would say, well, actually, there's a kind of anti-Semitism inherent in certain aspects of Zionism as well. So you can hear how complex these things are.
And then the confusion between supporting Israel and supporting Netanyahu's government, not making any distinction there. Yeah.
Indeed. And of course, which isn't assisted, in my view, by some of the language around what constitutes anti-Semitism and some of the definitions of anti-Semitism that are offered at the moment. So that's another area. Then, of course, we've got racism and white supremacism in its various forms. From the most extreme and I think to all right-thinking people, very self-evidently wicked ways of thinking, to ways that are cast in much more plausible terms. And again, I'm not wanting to say that it's inappropriate to think that we should put some limits on migration or immigration rather, but often there's a racism around the language that's used, around the imagery that's used. There's a kind of dog whistling that goes on. A classic example would be, so around the time of the Brexit campaign, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which is on the the right wing of normal British politics, had an energetic campaign to take us out of the European Union. And its then leader, Nigel Farage, had this big campaign, and he stood in front of a poster which they'd published. And it was a picture of non-white men. It was a huge kind of group of people. And he made out that this was a picture of, quote, swarms of migrants coming across, invading the United Kingdom. It actually was nothing of the sort. It was a picture of people crossing the Croatian border, I think. But so there's a kind of dog whistling going on. And there was one white person in the original photograph, actually, and that white person was obscured by a text box in the poster. So you see this sort of the way that these things are
Yes.
done. So white supremacism, racism of various sorts, kind of hostility towards immigrants, dog whistling, it's interesting that Britain has been far more quick and warm towards refugees from Ukraine than we were towards refugees from Syria or Afghanistan.
Yeah, same skin color. Yeah,
exactly. So that's another whole area. And then finally-ish, would be that these often get complexed with various conspiracisms. And this is particularly where we are influenced by right-wing extremism in the US. So QAnon, many people will know, is a big conspiracism around a whole load of things, including the idea that there's a worldwide kind of cabal of pedophiles, climate denial, Holocaust denial, COVID denial, and so on. And these things are not not niche, actually, really disturbingly. So there was a study done, I think it was Hope Not Hate that did it, and I think it was about 18 months ago, roughly. And they did a survey of 20,000 people, members of the general population in Britain. And they pitched these various conspiracisms to them, and they said, is this definitely untrue, maybe true, scale this sort of thing. And from responses saying this is definitely true or probably true, these conspiracisms were getting between 8 and 20% of the population was saying yes, definitely, or yes, probably. I think the Holocaust denial one was getting 8%. Some of the sort of narrative of kind of global Jewish cabal running the banking system was getting something like, off the top of my head, 13, 14%. Terrifyingly high rates. So this is not niche. And that's kind of the not very short, but actually not long enough.
And very much exacerbated by social media, as people tend to now just, through algorithms and so on, be listening to an echo chamber rather than drawing from traditional means of news and so on. Yes. Now, as we said, some of these issues Christians would generally want to support, morality, family values, etc. And yet, we see it with Orban, with Putin, with Trump, with Wilders, all these people that promoting some of these ideas and saying we are trying to defend the Christian heritage, the Judaic Christian heritage. I think in your book you talk about UKIP again, Nigel Farage, and his campaign theme leading up to the general election 2015. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So the United Kingdom Independence Party in that election published what they called a Christian manifesto, and their kind of strapline for their election campaign that year was valuing our Christian heritage, or one of the straplines anyway. And in the foreword to their quote Christian manifesto unquote, Farage wrote these words: "Britain needs a much more muscular defence of our Christian heritage and our Christian constitution. Sadly, I think UKIP is the only major political party left in Britain that still cherishes our Judeo-Christian heritage." So that's an example of the explicit employment of Christian tropes by some of these movements, which, quite frankly, in the main, have very little commitment, very little connection with what we would consider the essential true values of the Christian story, or indeed the great meta narrative of the Christian narrative of the Christian worldview. So there's sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Well, I was going to say some of these parties, they have names like, Britain First, or, this is Trump's line as well, America First. And it reminds me actually of when the disciples were asking Jesus, is this the time you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? It's as if, after 3 years of being with him, they haven't gotten the point that this is a message not just for Israel, but for everybody. And so often it's being used within Christian framework to say, but we've got to defend our people first. That's our first priority. And obviously, they're not very familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan, which it was a very shocking story for the Jewish listeners when Jesus first told it.
Yes, although interestingly, so I use the Good Samaritan to introduce my advanced hermeneutics module that I teach, because the number of interpretations of that parable is quite astonishing. And in fact, it is used by some of these far-right groups in their own particular way. So, yeah.
How would they use it?
What do they say? So hang on, let me just, I remember that. I'll tell you what Margaret Thatcher did with it. So Margaret Thatcher said, well, the Samaritan couldn't have done any good if he didn't have money in his pocket. So that was what they did. I think the far-right groups talk about the fact that the Samaritan doesn't take the man across any borders, and he treats him in situ, and that sort of. I think that's
yeah. Tell us a bit more about Britain First. You use that as an example in your book.
Yeah, so Britain First is an organisation that has really aggressively. Yeah, so these are the two of the leaders of Britain First. Jada Franson and Paul Golding, who have both served time in prison for religiously aggravated harassment. For example, invading mosques at the time of worship with army-issued Bibles, and they refer to this as a Christian crusade. Jada Franson has been quoted as saying that she was, quote, preaching the gospel outside a mosque, by which she means kind of loudly and vociferously kind of handing out political tracts and shouting about Muslims, I think. They made a habit for a few years of taking these huge white crosses, kind of almost human-sized white crosses, and aggressively parading through Muslim-majority areas of British cities, kind of shouting about being Christian and how Muslims aren't welcome. And that's the sort of thing that got them, that got them arrested.
I think too in your book you mentioned an incident that took place in Bristol Cathedral. That'll be in your home territory.
Yes, so just a couple of miles from where I live, Bristol Cathedral. So during Ramadan last year, they invited any citizens who would like to join with local Muslims breaking their fast, having their iftar. And the plan was that that was going to take place in College Green, which is right outside the cathedral. I think the cathedral owns the land. But I think the plan B always was, if the weather was poor, that they would move into the cathedral. And indeed, it did rain, because it usually does here. And so they were then invited into the cathedral to continue their iftar in the cathedral. Now, I wish I'd been part of it, actually. I would have gone down if I'd known about it and been free. But I have looked at the imagery and the video imagery, and I can't see that there was any evidence of any act of worship that took place. It was simply a feast. And there's lovely imagery, actually, if you look at the videos of families eating and children running around and playing together and so on. But this video footage of this event then went online. And as one might imagine, people then quickly took to their microphones and their keyboards to denounce this. One of them is an ordained priest who has quite a significant following on Twitter. At the time, I think about 1/3 of a million. And he denounced this loudly, taking it as a sign that we're living in the Islamic Caliphate of Britain, quoting Deuteronomy about, you shall not go after other gods because the Lord your God is a jealous God. Another prominent YouTuber spoke about how this was how he compared it. In fact, lots of people compared it to the Ottoman takeover of Hagia Sophia. And saying that we need a new crusade. I mean,
back in the 15th century.
And this language is so. I mean, people talking about this is an Islamic conquest. They've conquered us without firing a shot. We need a new crusade. We need this. This is, make no mistake, this is violent language, and it's being done in the name of Christianity.
So in the name of your center, the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence, this is the very abuse of the Bible. Now, you're quoting theologians in your book. I ordered your book, but it hasn't arrived yet. But I think you've got a copy of the book.
I have got a copy here.
Okay, that's it. Yeah. So you quote these 4 theologians who examined the claims made by were they 4 theologians, but they're 4 different far-right groups.
Studies.
And what did they conclude?
Well, what they concluded, in fact, this was so, I'll read it to you now, but it was so, I found it so provocative and disturbing that really that's what kind of catalyzed the research that we then conducted and that ended up in our book. And they said this, speaking about these political readings of the Bible, they said, the book I'm referring to is called The Claim to Christianity, and it's by Hannah Stroman and Ulrich Schmeidel. And they say this, trained theologians might not like these political readings of the Bible. Biblical scholars might say they are historically implausible, that they are hermeneutically incorrect, or that they are willfully wrong. And I'll pause, I'll come back to that quotation in a minute. And I would say those things. I would say that the Bible is being taken out of context, that poor hermeneutics are being used, that that cultural background is being disregarded, and so on. But Stroman and Schmeidel go on to say, but these readings are still there, and the theologies that run through the far right didn't appear out of nowhere. And that's kind of chilling and sobering. And the challenge that they make in their book is that the church should stop saying, oh, that's not us, that's them, they are misusing our Bible. And I do believe those things, but that's not the way we should approach it. That the way we should approach it is by acknowledging the fact that, actually in the way that we've just been discussing, there is continuity sometimes between what I would call Orthodox Christian thought and what they are saying, that sometimes the way churches have conducted themselves, the way we have incautiously interpreted scripture, the things we have allowed to foster in our churches have allowed these things to grow. And we need to see them as part of the family problem that we can address I don't mean silently, I don't mean quietly covering things up, but we can address, as it were, within the family rather than othering them and saying nothing to do with us. And then that's a more fruitful way of approaching it.
Yes, well, we like to talk about King David as a man after God's heart and so on, and yet we read about him being praised by all the women there, saying, well, Saul killed the thousands and he's killed the tens of thousands. Hooray for David. I mean, you can understand how non-Christians look at that and think, well, this is just a violent book. How do we...
Yes, in fact, the terrorist who killed all those young people in Utoya Island a few years ago, so the huge manifesto which was found in his flat after he was arrested made all sorts of allusions to scripture, and one of the ones he came back to a number of times was the Lord God is a man of war. So that's another very classic example. So
yeah go ahead. your center for the study of Bible and violence is you described as being international, ecumenical, interfaith, interdisciplinary, and you're trying to help experts in a variety of fields alongside those with on-the-ground experience, helping the church to respond to democratic threat by extremist groups. And that's how the book actually came together. You gathered these people from different groups to come up to give us guidelines. Well, how do we respond? Because we're walking a tightrope. We're walking through a minefield in some ways. We've got liberalism on the one hand, and we've got these extremists on the other. So what was the bottom line, really, of the book?
So if I might just correct you, the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence is not interfaith. We are a Christian organisation, although we are interdisciplinary. But we gathered...
It was the group that you got together.
Yes, we convened a group of about 14 people with on-the-ground experience, academics. It was interfaith, it was interdisciplinary and so on. And we gathered for a 24-hour consultation. I should say that we had British Academy funding for that. And we're very grateful to the British Academy for allowing that to happen.
So when you say interfaith, that means different things to different people.
Sure. So we had
involved.
So we had a Muslim, and we had a Muslim senior participant in the Muslim Christian Forum in the UK, and we had a senior rabbi who joined us. We also were very ecumenical. We had
but Abrahamic,
Abrahamic, yes. Yes. Principally because those are the constituencies that have most at stake in these conversations in the UK at the moment.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. So we dialogued together, kind of taking as our starting point these provocations from the Stroman and Schmeidel book, and we reflected together on those. There were lots of different opinions in the room. We've tried to reflect that in the book. So the book is an edited collection from most of the contributors, and there's a kind of dialogical element to the book. But reflecting through that process and through obviously reading and editing those papers, I then offer at the end of the book my own conclusions. And I draw together what I think are 10 action points that the church in Britain could do in order to help resist these things. So this is not really principally a theological book. There is theology in it, but this isn't a theological denunciation of the far right. There are some of those out there, and I think there's more to be done in that area. But this is more practical steps that the churches can do in order to bring what we hope is good theology actually to bear in meaningful ways. So we have 10, and I can go through those if that would be helpful.
Yeah, take us through those 10. Yeah.
So the first thing we talk about is I caption it as speak humbly. And this is about acknowledging actually that this is our problem. This is our problem historically, and even in parts of the church today, that this is something that we have complicity with. The church has been historically anti-Semitic at times. The church has been and still is sometimes Islamophobic at times, and racist, and so on and so forth. So until we acknowledge that this is something that we have collective responsibility and complicity in, then we really can't proceed. So that's the first thing that we need to do, I think. We had quite a long conversation about the need to disavow violent acts. This was really helpful contribution that our Muslim contributor brought to our attention, really, because she was speaking about the way that whenever there is any act of terrorism that is done in the name of Islam, ordinary Muslims, somebody who runs a corner shop or has a small business in something completely, a dentist or something, they're all expected sort of publicly to denounce this. Yeah. As if there is otherwise that they are kind of endorsing it and complicit within it. And she talked about how inappropriate that was and actually how exhausting it is. And that was really helpful for us to learn and understand. But nonetheless, we think it's important that the church does speak clearly, but probably at senior denominational levels and perhaps senior church levels, rather than every individual Christian needing to do this. But we need to be very clear. that when acts of violence take place, apparently in the name of Christianity, that we disassociate ourselves from those things. Now, one of the next one is about stereotyping. And there are two particular stereotypes that we can unwittingly reinforce. One of them is about Muslim illiberality. And sometimes we do this kind of accidentally and with the best of intentions. And Schuman and Schmeidel draw this out in their book. So this is one that we've kind of borrowed from them, really, because they speak about how when the church positions itself as the convener of dialogue, which we do, and I think we should continue to do, hosting hustings, for example, coming up to an election. But we can, if we're not careful and thoughtful about how we do that, position ourselves as the upholder of democratic dialogue, and therefore other people that we are bringing into that space as beneficiaries of that, or even potentially as threats. And so we can position ourselves as the upholder of democratic dialogue and therefore reinforce stereotypes of Muslim illiberality.
Yeah.
Another stereotype it's important to resist is the stereotype that that these extreme right movements are centered in the white working class, and that white working class people are racist. There is a lot of dark money funding these movements, and it certainly isn't coming from the white council estates. At the same time, we need to be attentive to the structural and sociological factors that the deprivation, the structural deprivation that people in our white council estates are experiencing, generational unemployment and so on, which make these narratives more plausible in those places. So without wanting to stereotype, without wanting, and being aware that many of the people working in this area are people from what we might call the metropolitan elite, people who, we are probably politically liberal, we are university educated, we're moderately affluent, we're probably not working class. And so we can be seen, we can actually be doing, we're talking down to working class people and telling them not to be so nasty and bigoted, without looking for the structural causes and looking to support, try and prevent it, ameliorate these structural causes. So I'm going slightly out of order in my points here, but it's about looking at the causes of the ways that far right ideology can take root, the causes of those things, understanding, looking with curiosity and compassion at the places where these do take root, looking at underlying drivers and participating with, working hard and participating with others in trying to tackle those. One of the things that didn't make it into the book, but I would put into a second edition, and one of the things I'm saying is that I think that the church in Britain, and I'm confident this is true more widely as well, is very active in many of these areas. We work hard in the area of poverty relief. We work hard to support refugees coming to the country and so on and so forth. Sometimes these things are managed by separate issue groups within the church, or special issue groups within the church who are separate from one another. So a particular church or a particular denomination will have a ministry for poverty relief, for debt relief, for food banks and so on, often particularly serving traditional communities. And then the church will have a ministry towards refugees, to asylum seekers, to those who've been cut loose by our cruel system without public recourse to public funds and so on. And these, of course, are people who are not in our traditional population, who are generally not white-skinned, for example. And those are both really important things to do, but they can find themselves in competition with one another for church attention, for staffing, for funding, and so on. And so one recommendation we make is to try and bring these under the same umbrella, so that there is not this sense of competition which reinforces these divides rather than minimizes them.
Yeah.
We speak about, do you want me to pause? Sorry.
Yeah, well, you talked about in your list about promoting dialogue. Can you say something about that? And what do you mean by be attentive to hijacking by bad actors? What do you mean by that?
Yes, so it's really important that we dialogue in terms of interfaith dialogue, in terms of conversations there, but also in terms of dialoguing with those who lean in the directions that we are speaking about. Now, this is not the same as saying that we should be trying to de-radicalize people. That is a specialist thing that churches should not be meddling in. That needs being done by specialists, just like we would refer people for specialist trauma counseling or specialist medical care. But for those who are, on the fringes of these movements, dialogue can be really helpful. What we need to realize, though, is that sometimes we say bad actors, some of the bad guys in these movements, they will string, and this was first-hand testimony we got from our group, really. They will string people along for months. They will say, oh, maybe you've got a point. Can we meet again to talk a bit more? And then, 6 months down the line, when we've sunk hundreds of hours into dialogue with an individual, we realize that actually they had absolutely no intention of shifting their stance at all. They're just playing games. So being aware of that, making sure that when dialogue is convened, that there are rules of engagement and that those are actually enforced. So making it a safe space for people to dialogue, but also, believing that extremist views actually shrivel when they are exposed to the oxygen of I think I may be mixing my metaphors here, but when they come into the light of public scrutiny, that actually their small-mindedness and their narrowness is often exposed.
Yeah. Now you also see a danger in the radicalization of young people. What can we do about that?
Yes, so there's things around promotion of biblical literacy or religious literacy in our schools. Again, this isn't something that we talk about so much in the book, I think, but something that I've raised three daughters, and I watched their religious education. And this isn't a criticism of the school or of their teachers, but of the exam systems that they were part of. The way that they were taught proof texts, and that the way that they were encouraged to believe that both Christians and Muslims, because that's the two faiths they studied, are proof texters, and that doesn't promote respect for these faiths or people in these faiths. It doesn't promote understanding of these faiths. It caricatures them and makes people despise them, I think, ultimately. So there's something about religious literacy which is a really big issue. But church youth work has been cut as actually broader, societal youth work has seen massive funding cuts in this country in the last 15, 20 years because of our financial situation. I think COVID has exacerbated that further. When I was thinking my way into this subject about, 4 years ago now, probably, I went to a conference run by the Centre for the Analysis of the Radical Right. And as part of that conference, we heard testimony from two, what they called formers. And these are men who had been formerly involved in these movements and violent and had now been de-radicalized. And they spoke about how they became radicalized in the first place. And both of them had the same element in their story, which is that they were radicalized in their teens, that they weren't particularly ideologically driven in the first instance, that they fell in with a group who gave them purpose, value, self-esteem, and community. And then they became radicalized. And it's a common story I've discovered since, and it's heartbreaking. But I do remember thinking at the time, what if those young men had fallen in with a church youth group? How might their life have been different? So we make a really strong appeal that we take seriously the ways that we can actively help by promoting good youth work, both good youth work within churches and youth work that brings Christian young people into dialogue with Muslim young people for understanding and engagement. There's some fantastic projects that are out there, but we'd love to see those gaining traction.
So with young people, the relational dimension seems very important. You talked about identity, a sense of belonging.
Yes.
It's not necessarily, the ideology behind it, but they pick that up by osmosis.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So your last point is about learning from history. What should we learn from history?
Well, this is a bit of a niche, a bit of a sub point, I suppose. But because I think that all of the all of the ecclesial traditions have things that they can add to bring, particular gifts they can bring to this struggle. But one of the conversations that we kept coming back to during our consultation was kind of agonizing about the use of power. Excuse me. How do we handle our power well? How do we give power away? How do we operate in a way that doesn't reinforce stereotypes and all this sort of thing? And I had a notepad I was using obviously during the meeting, and I just kept doodling Baptists, because actually I think the dissenting traditions have something particular to add here, which is that we have always positioned ourselves at the edge rather than the center of the political system, which is not to say that individual dissenters haven't served in government and so on, but that's different from looking for structural power. We have always, the Baptist tradition has always embraced plurality, has defended religious freedom. These are things that I believe passionately. But actually, sadly, I think that in this country, Baptists don't really know what that means, by and large, in the churches. I think that Baptist probably is seen as a bit of a synonym for boring, middle of the road, which is so sad, because that's not how we started. It's, our radical roots. It was dangerous to be Baptist originally, and it was dangerous for good reasons. So I would love us to recapture these stories, tell them afresh to a new generation, because I think this is something really valuable that we can bring.
I think you would be aware of the origins of that story. Just less than 2 kilometers from where I'm sitting right now, this is where Thomas Helwys and John Smith came across with the Pilgrim Fathers from England. They actually financed their trip, brought them across here to Amsterdam because it's a place of freedom. After a little while, the Pilgrim Fathers perhaps thought there was too much freedom. They went elsewhere. But this is where Smith and Helwys were influenced by Mennonites in the city. And I often take people on tours to the house where they first had their meetings, had their baptism service. And that's when Helwys went back to England in 1611, I think it was. And that's where he started the Baptist church. So, yeah, they were very much in search of freedom, often understood to be on the far right themselves, if you like, associated with the radical Reformation. So that's a very good point you're making. Yeah. So lastly, Helen, we've been talking a lot about Britain. What would you like to say to Europeans on this theme?
Well, in a sense, I'm intrigued by the question, and it's not the first. So our contributors to the book included 2 members of the clergy from the Lutheran tradition from Scandinavia. And we invited them because they had particular expertise in working in this area in different ways. And recently they have convened a seminar on the contents of this book, and invited me as one of the editors to contribute to that seminar, saying, what can we learn? And I'm thinking, but we've been learning from you. So in a sense, I mean, I think there are things in this book that I hope would be of use to the churches in Europe. But actually, I feel like we're the learners, because I think in many parts of Europe, the church is way ahead.
What do you feel you learned from the Scandinavians then? What were they doing right?
Yes,
well, so what were they doing wrong?
No, I think they had some really positive examples. So there's anecdotes really, but things that worked well. So one was about, it was in Sweden, and it was there was a campaign by the far right to do a public burning of the Quran, and
yes.
The churches united and worked beyond the church as well, so it wasn't a siloed thing, to creatively disrupt it. And it was beautiful. In one place they sometimes it was more like just demonstrating or kind of blocking access, but the churches just decided to ring their bells all day, so that it just made the place intolerable for public kind of assembly. So there was just some lovely stories about that sort of. We didn't speak about one of my proposals, which is the churches need to be prophetic, and not, of course, meaning foretelling, but in terms of bringing to bear the values of the kingdom. And I thought there were some wonderful stories there. And then our other Scandinavian contributor had been part of something called, translates into English as the Dialogue Pilots. And this is a move, something with young people, bringing young people together and helping them to dialogue in ways that didn't ablate their. I mean, I'm slightly nervous about paraphrasing, what they did, because it was rich and it was nuanced, and I don't want to collapse it down to a couple of sentences. But one of the things that they did was, it was about acknowledging their own faith, their own positionality, without needing to compromise that, and learning to dialogue with confidence in who they were, but developing these skills of grace and good listening. That was beautiful, and definitely something that we would love to see rolled out more extensively in Britain. There's a project here called The Feast, which has also been done in, I think it's called Bread and Salt in Lebanon. So some of these youth projects, these youth dialogue projects, are wonderful. So these are some of the things that we have learned that we would then want to reflect back to continental Europe and say, keep going and keep leading the way.
How can Christians overcome their fear of Muslims? Because this seems to be one of the big issues, is that, we live in our own silos, we live in our own bubbles. And it's fear of the unknown. It's a fear of the other.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. And I think it's about expanding our circles of acquaintance. It's so often true, isn't it, that people who have a sort of generalized fear or a generalized antipathy towards a people group will make an exception. It's like, but not Shanaz, who lives next door. She's all right. Actually, as we expand our contacts, as we learn to live with people and discover our areas of commonality. So I plucked the name Shanaz out of thin air then, but actually Shanaz is the name of our Muslim contributor to this book. And working with her has just been a joy, and learning about her deep faith, but actually seeing the many points of agreement. And of course, are things I can respect that I don't agree with, but the many points in which we do agree, the many areas in which we are working in similar ways for community cohesion. So I think contact, learning to understand, building of religious literacy that I was speaking earlier about.
We're so ignorant too about the Muslim faith. Jesus has talked about more in the Quran than anybody else, and the story of Christmas. The birth of Jesus is told there as well. We had a couple of Yemeni girls join us for Christmas a few years ago, and we just compared the stories. And for myself, it was amazing to learn that. And so to overcome that fear by making contact personally with Muslims is part of that answer as well. Building relationships.
One of our contributors, Martin Akkad, who is in Lebanon, elsewhere, not in our book, but elsewhere, has published something called, he calls the CCAP spectrum of interfaith engagement. And he says there's different ways that Christians engage with Muslims, from kind of really quite aggressive and polemical evangelism to complete syncretism. And I think it's a 5-point scale. And the middle one is the K of that CCAP. He calls it kerygmatic. And that's a model of engagement which both acknowledges difference, but also listens respectfully. So it's not about saying, our differences don't matter. It's not about saying, I think actually that your way is as right as mine. It's acknowledging, well, actually, I believe that I happen to believe that Jesus is the way, so it's kind of acknowledging that, but also engaging in generous, respectful, listening dialogue. And I find that model very helpful for thinking about what's going on, but also for kind of challenging where we position ourselves when we dialogue.
So when you use the word dialogue, a lot of people think, well, that involves compromise. But as you say, no, you say, this is my position and I want to understand where you're coming from as well.
Yes, and
It's
finding
to
areas of
clarify,
commonality.
yes, and
Yeah.
then seek for the common ground. Yeah.
Yes. So
Well,
as part of the events we're running around this book, we did an event with the Christian Muslim Forum in Lambeth Palace a few months ago. And so there was roughly 50% Muslims, 50% Christians in the room. We presented this work, and then we had some groups to discuss it. And listening to our Muslim friends' kind of passion for improving religious literacy among young people, which absolutely mirrored our own, was wonderful, actually. It's like, and actually listening to the ways that they are seeking to do youth work well, and in these dialogical ways as well. So finding places where actually we wholly agree with one another that these are things we need to be working in.
Well, thank you, Helen. This has been a fascinating conversation, very helpful for me, and I'm sure for our listeners as well. Thank you very much for joining. And obviously, we're just beginning. We really need to take this seriously to continue to learn. And I've just come across this book here, Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear. And I'm hoping that Matthew Kaming, who is actually from Fuller in America, but he has a Dutch name. I think Dutch background. He certainly studied here in Amsterdam and other places. I'm hoping he will be a guest in the future and will be able to take this theme further as he explores how Abraham Kuyper, with his vision of a pluralistic society, and can show us ways where we can live together. That our exclusive faith in Jesus being the way to the Father does not mean that it's impossible to live together in harmony with others. And so thank you, Helen, for your contribution and the work you've done in making this book available as well. Hold it up again just one more time so that we see the title for those who haven't yet got it. The Church, the Far Right, and the Claim to Christianity, an extremely topical issue that we need to find Christian answers for. So thank you, Helen, for being with us today.